Central banks are pushing up interest rates because prices are going up. There's too much demand for the goods and services that are available to buy. So they want to squash that demand right down. And they are worried that as prices rise, people will ask for more pay, which will push prices up even more and cause a wage spiral. But strangely, some central banks, like the US Federal Reserve, seem to think you can push rates up, stop inflation, and not push the economy into a recession, the so-called soft landing that they're aiming for. And the Fed is using the Beverage Curve as part of the reasoning for how they will do this. So is it possible, or is it just wishful thinking? That's this week on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. So there is still this belief, Steve, that the US and other places around the world can weather this supply-driven inflation that we are seeing right now without the economy hitting a hard landing. That somehow central banks can navigate this way through. Sorry. But how likely is that? Is it even possible?
Look, I just had to duck. There was a flying pig I had to get underneath. Yeah.
But they believe it. This is what they're putting out there, isn't it? And
yeah.
So part of the reasoning is that they give in the US, they seem to be attaching quite a bit to what they call the Beverage Curve. And I know that Jerome Powell has been paying a great deal of attention to what's called the JOLTS data, the job openings data. So they're looking at the number of jobs that are around, of which there are many, sort of like 2 for every person who's unemployed, and saying, oh, look, you know, there's all of this extra capacity in the jobs market. So we can see, so long as we see, you know, we can see things change. We can see the job vacancy rate go down without the unemployment rate going down. And that's how we're going to see the labour market tightening without anyone feeling the consequences. That is the logic that they're putting out there. And they're using the Beveridge Curve as the mechanism, which looks at the relationship between unemployment and the job vacancy rate. So how many jobs there are theoretically per person. As I say, there's 2 jobs per person, per vacancy in the United States. Yeah. I mean, does any of that make sense? Or is it just applying a mathematical equation just for the sake of creating a mathematical equation?
No, there's certainly a relationship between the vacancy rate and the number of jobs on offer and the number of people who haven't got a job. And what economists often bring their arguments about unemployment down to is simply a mismatch of skills to available positions. So they say that you can have that situation where there's more than one job per person that's unemployed, but there's still unemployment because the people looking for jobs as pastry chefs and the people you've got are metal workers. So they say that's one of their arguments, and they say it's just a case of the market slowly fine-tuning itself until such time as the vacancies that are there are available to the people who have the skills that are required for those vacancies. And then what you are left with is what they call frictional unemployment, where the unemployment rate is just people who've left a job and haven't yet got another job, but have not themselves being unable to find a job through a lack of aggregate demand. That's the basic thinking. And within its, within normal circumstances, inverted commas type situations, then it's a reasonable guide. But I wouldn't be using this as a guide to what's going to happen with policy.
No, and what's going to happen over the next few months with inflation, because this is not normally what you see with a recession, for example, is it? Normally with a recession, you see lots of unemployed people and not many jobs, whereas this time we are the other way around, and yet there are still these fears of recession.
But yeah, a lot of this is. I mean, have you been to an airplane flight recently?
No.
I don't recommend it because you spend longer queuing to get into the airport than you spend flying. The reason being that the security apparatus around the globe, particularly large airports like Schiphol Airport, which is the one that when I fly out of Schiphol from Amsterdam. And what I've heard from friends in Sydney Airport as well, including seeing some pretty classic photographs on Twitter, there's enormous queues to get in. And why are there queues? Because there aren't enough skilled personnel to operate the security cameras. And the reason there aren't enough people is partially the sackings that were done during COVID, but also people coming down with COVID now who are skilled operators on those machines. You cannot train somebody else up in the meantime. So the queues occur. Now, that's a classic case of a skill mismatch. But what's actually causing the vacancy, you could actually probably see ads now for people to be rapidly trained up to use these machines. What's causing the mismatch is COVID. It's not anything to do with aggregate demand, insufficiency of aggregate demand causing unemployment, and therefore, high rising unemployment and falling wages. It's a very, very different situation. And as usual, they're diving in with the tools that they know into a world they don't know.
So you're saying that a big chunk of, because obviously in that airport situation, we are now seeing a massive peak in airfares. So, for example, I'm travelling to Australia at the end of the year, and that if I bought the tickets in January, if I bought them now, they would be twice the price that I paid for in January because the airfares have gone up that much, and domestic airfares are just crazy. And in Australia, I think particularly, someone was telling me this week they were trying to go from Sydney to Melbourne, and it was something like $800 for a one-way ticket. So maybe it was.
Oh my God!
Maybe that was for two of them, but even so, it's still way higher than it should be. So is a chunk of that because okay, oil prices have gone up, but also staff costs have gone up because of this mismatch between skilled people and the jobs that are available. And if that was the case, then you'd assume that over time that will get better, won't it? That people will be skilled up into the right jobs, and that mismatch will start to correct itself, and therefore if wages are a part of this inflation, then that will start to ease off and come down.
I think the other thing which can happen, this is what actually I think will happen, is that the vacancy rate will plunge because now we're seeing the end of the big stimulus. The huge reason why we came through COVID in terms of economically with the shortest, very, very steep, but the shortest economic downturn in the history, I think, of American data. The reason was the gigantic stimulus was done. The fiscal, I think the deficit in America reached 23% of GDP. That meant a 23% of GDP increase in people's bank accounts. And this is the point which modern monetary theory makes extremely well, and I can establish the same thing using my Minsky software. The government deficit is dollar for dollar an increase in private sector bank accounts,
right?
And therefore, with that much more money, even though we had the stilted economy caused by COVID, demand rose in all sorts of areas because you couldn't fly for some time, so the money going into flying was going into domestic holidays, which meant you were buying domestic food, which meant you need more people working in restaurants, which you couldn't get because they had COVID,
right,
etc., etc. But all those pressures, we've still got COVID. I mean, I've given up on any potential for sensible policy at the national level anywhere, and that's what's actually happened. We've surrendered and called it victory. But
I've never had it, by the way.
Neither have I. Neither have I, and that's because I wear a crazy mask, which is a personal HEPA filter. I ain't going to get the damn thing until as long as I can possibly delay it. But most of my friends now have had it. But the thing is, they're going to have it again and again and again. And this is the thing: you can actually catch it. You can get reinfected within less than 2 months
of
having a previous infection.
Now, I'm not allowed to talk out against modern monetary theory. I don't want to either. But whenever I even give the slightest hint of a criticism, then an email comes in from someone who says I'm not a believer and I'm towing the middle line because I'm trying to keep my jobs elsewhere. It might be partially true, but also I'm just being devil's advocate on all of this. But isn't this an example of modern monetary theory and why it needs to be controlled? So you put a whole slug of money into the economy, like we did. Lots of money goes into people's bank accounts. They start demanding stuff. There's not enough stuff there to meet that demand. You get inflation. So
that's exactly what monetary theory admits. So if you have too much, my way of thinking about modern monetary theory is, first of all, it is not modern monetary theory. It's accounting. Yeah. When you do the accounting, you get the results that modern monetary theory says, and that's what it's not modern monetary theory. It's modern monetary fact.
Yeah.
Okay? But then the question is, what does that fact do when you create that much more money and inject it into the economy? Does it push up prices, or does it expand demand? Now, that again depends on what your effective level of capacity utilization is in the economy itself.
It's the speed at which you do it, isn't it?
The speed at which this was done very rapidly. It had to be done rapidly. If it hadn't been done rapidly, society would have fallen apart. There would have been no capacity for people to pay their mortgages, to pay their rents. There would have been bankruptcies. The banks would have failed. This is an absolutely essential time where we use the government's capacity to create money. But that necessarily caused a spike in demand. Now, the thing is, I think that spike's going to disappear. Because it's still not, even the people who did this don't realise what they did. I mean, you see all this thing. Wow, people have saved so much more money during COVID. How did that happen? It's because you created 23% of GDP initial money, you moron.
Yeah.
That's why it happened. But they're not realising that. They're not saying, we've got to go back and balance the budget. And you can see this not only in what's actually Biden's not so bad on that front, I must say. The Americans aren't so bad. But you can see that rhetoric in the UK. You can see it in Australia with Jim Chalmers, the new Treasurer, saying he's got to repair the budget. So what we're going to do as a kind of government, stop creating that much more money, go from 23% down to, say, 3%. And then, of course, there'll be, in the change from that level down, we're going to have a dramatic drop in demand. So I think that's the first thing which is coming through.
So is that through taxation? How do you get that down? I mean, you've got to pull that money out. So through taxation?
Well, or they cut back on various forms of spending. And when they cut back on spending, the people who suffer clearly are the rich. You know, because the rich need their Medicare cards, otherwise they can't afford to go to hospital, and they need their. So
that's a problem, isn't it?
They need their train transport, otherwise they can't afford to.
Yeah. So how do you cut back on spending at a time like this without impacting the people who really need it? And
exactly, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the incredible increase in the cost of energy in Europe, in particular, meaning people are getting bills which are 5 times what they were last year, and therefore they simply can't afford to buy a whole range of other things. So we're getting a contraction in demand caused by that energy surge in energy prices and drop in energy availability as well, and then on top of interest rates rises. So all these things I think are going to, first of all, you've got government stimulus being taken out of the economy, interest rates being driven up, which increases the cost of existing financing. But what I think is going to cause is a credit crunch, because people, they're seeing house prices falling globally now as well. So the fear of missing out is now the fear of going bankrupt. And therefore, the credit-based demand, which is highly positive in the early initial period of COVID, a dramatic increase in borrowing, which of course fed into the asset markets and caused those huge bubbles in house prices. If that goes into reverse and we have negative credit, then you've got the triple whammy: rising interest rates, which make servicing existing debt much harder and force people to cut back on normal consumption, meaning therefore recorded GDP falls that way. Falling real wages, because inflation is running at 2 or 3 times the rate of wage changes, so people are forced to spend less because of that. Rising energy costs, so you've got less to spend on everything else. Governments cutting back on deficits, and then you have people in this situation, the last thing you want to do is take on more debt. You're going to try to pay your debt off, which might involve selling assets, and you have asset price deflation coming out of that. So I think we're up for forget the Beverage Curve. We're going to trash that, because vacancies are going to plunge, and unemployment is going to rise, and that will take us back to the situation where you've got
so vacancies are going to fall simply because the economy is shrinking. So there's going to be less jobs around.
Yeah.
So,
you will do. Employers, even though they need staff, won't be hiring them. And this is so the vacancy rate, the ratio is going to plunge. Which
is actually what the Federal Reserve is hoping for, isn't it? Look, there's a lot more to this discussion. If you want to hear it in full, you need to become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen, or become a subscriber at debunkingeconomics.com. That's it for this week. I'm Phil Dobbie, back with Steve Keen for another one next week. Thanks for listening in today. See you soon.